This week, the reign of fear brought on by Andrew Cunanan came to a dramatic end. With us now are the three people who the world looked to identify the murderer and then find him before he killed again. Paul Phillip, FBI Special Agent in Charge, Kathy Fernandez-Rundle, the Dade State Attorney, and also Chief Richard Barreto of the Miami Beach Police Department. We appreciate you all coming today. And also joining the conversation is NBC6 reporter Robin Kish. We have Michael Williams. Both of them were very instrumental in breaking a number of the events over the last 12 days, and welcome to all of you. Chief, the first question I'm going to throw out to you. I think we all sort of breathed a cumulative sigh of relief when we found out that Andrew Cunanan was dead. I can imagine it must have been even more so in your case.
Well, absolutely. We had an intense effort underway to locate him and to eliminate that threat. Our worst fear was that we were going to find another victim, and that fear certainly has been alleviated. And I think people all across this nation can breathe a sigh of relief.
Is there any doubt in your mind, Paul, he's been connected to 5 murders now. Is there any doubt in your mind that he was responsible for all 5 of these murders? Because obviously there's never going to be a trial.
Right. I think there's enough evidence to link him to the murders, and I would suspect that we would have convicted him had we tried him. You know, in the case of the truck that came from one of the victims, the weapon came from another victim. I think we're in pretty good shape.
Mr. Phillip, or to the Chief, I'd put this question. In the House book, which has been undergoing a lot of scrutiny these last few days, is there evidence, material evidence, beyond the .40 caliber handgun that ties him to the Versace murder? And or is there material evidence, physical evidence, that ties him to any of these other 4 murders across the country?
Well, certainly we're analyzing the weapon at this time, and we're convinced that that will tie him to the Versace killing. I haven't commented on a lot of the evidence that we've seized there, and I do that out of respect for our investigators who've asked me not to share that information.
If not specifically, can you say whether there is indeed, though, evidence that does look to tie him to the other murders across the country? Either one of you, Mr. Phillip or Chief.
Well, certainly we're looking at all of the items that are there to, one, establish a link between the Versace killing, and certainly if there was anything that would contribute to the cases that were from the other states, we would bring that to the attention of those authorities.
There was a safe inside. We know that from some of the documentation. Has that safe been opened, and can you give us an idea of its contents?
No, it has not been opened at this time. Currently we're reviewing the legality of entering the safe, which was seized pursuant to a warrant.
Mr. Phillip, your people are involved with an affidavit there. Any indications early on that there at least are, or is material evidence tying them to these other 4 murders? We know your people have been in there, have affidavits served.
Well, as the Chief said, we'll look at everything, but I think the weapon is something that's of interest to us. I think it's been released that the serial number matched a weapon that was the results of a homicide previously. So those sorts of ties will be fully developed. But again,
that weapon was believed stolen, right? That was stolen from one of the victims?
Well, it belonged to, I assume it was stolen, yeah. It belonged to one of the victims, yes. So that ties it in nicely. But you have to understand that we have investigators out there that are still investigating, still putting stuff together, and we just want to hold off just a wee bit until we release that sort of information. And in all cases, I'm going to defer to the state prosecutor and to the chief on that, because for all intents and purposes, my investigation is pretty much over.
For some people who are involved in law enforcement, they understand perhaps why so many pieces of the puzzle are not being released that you may possess. But what is the reason why some of this information can't come out when your suspect is dead?
Well, let me just say this. This may not be the only crime. We may find other crimes in there, such as if someone aided and abetted him in his flight. There may be other victims elsewhere. So we'll just wait to see.
What did the crime scene look like, Kathy? What was in there? Were there newspapers? Were there magazines? Did you find more gold coins? What actually was in there?
Going back to sort of the integrity of the investigation, I just, if I could address that, because I think what we need to understand is, as we speak, witnesses are being interviewed. We still need to get with the other prosecutors around the country and share information so that all of the answers all the questions that most of us have can be answered. And the best way to ensure that that occurs is to make sure we don't talk too much about the evidence that we found. And while that can be very frustrating, it's very critical to maintain the integrity of the investigation, because if we really want to get to the truth of the issues, that's what we're going to have to do. So bear with us a little bit.
Even in general terms, because we know that at the red truck, for example, there were clothing was found. We know the coin was found, the coin was found at the pawn shop. The hotel room, I think it was supposed to have magazines and books, one book in particular. Can you give us some general idea, other than the safe, of what was in there? Was there food in the refrigerator, for example? How was this man eating and living?
To be very candid with you, I did not go onto the crime scene. I rarely do. With respect to this particular house, but that was the closest I've been to a crime scene in some time. The investigation is being conducted by our investigators, and that's their job to do that, and they have a sense for what they need to accomplish, and they are advised by the state attorney as to what they can release. I can speculate that they seized papers, phone records. We know that the safe was taken out of there. I'm sure that they took samples of sheeting and perhaps the carpet where Mr. Cunanan was found. They seized the weapon. They looked for suicide notes. We articulated that they found none at that time. So generally, I would suspect that they probably did take food wrappers, empty ones probably, that he had perhaps been using. And
was there a television?
I really don't know. I would, just looking at the house, I got to surmise that there was a television in there.
I'm told there was a TV in there, yes.
Any indication of whether he was watching any of the coverage on television?
Hard to tell.
I can tell you that was a great concern, because I was even called by my wife at home and said, how can the helicopters be showing these SWAT guys hiding behind trees and all?
Absolutely.
If this guy's watching, he knows exactly where they are. And that is a legitimate concern of law enforcement today, that jeopardizing the safety of officers who are trying to do a very difficult job.
We're looking at some video of one of the shots the day this was all breaking, and there were some shots at points where you could see SWAT members. This is actually them firing the tear gas. Although this was taped and broadcast after the fact, and you had made an interesting point earlier on, Paul, about how to show this live would have really been a travesty to you.
Yes, some stations were showing it live, and that's I think a terrible mistake. Our goal in these things is to resolve these disputes with no loss of life, ours or theirs. If an individual is watching a TV and it's showing our troops coming in, it's unacceptable. Mm-hmm. Just unacceptable.
Robin and Michael, when this was all happening and the report initially came out, as you've spoken about a considerable amount about how there was at first no body believed to be in there, and then you two started working your sources and found out in a relatively short period of time that in fact there was, and that maybe it was Cunanan. Tell us a little bit about how that process worked and about how that affected you. I mean, are you upset about that originally came down as a no body?
I think we were so busy working and talking to people who indeed said that there is a body in there. I didn't think about it a lot. I'll be candid, and I'm sure the chief would like to address it. There are a lot of people upset because they felt there was miscommunication, and I think that night, candidly, people who felt that it was more than miscommunication, that they might have been misled, and when they did know there was a body, why not come out and say, look, we were wrong about that, there's a body. There was a long time period there, but you can understand, at least initially, there's a lot of confusion in there, and SRT teams trying to secure the scene. Exactly. Why initially there might be that confusion. I think the greater cause for anger among many of the media outlets was, okay, honest mistake, but why not at least come out much quicker and say, hey, there's a body in there, so we may have a totally different situation. Why not?
Well, let me go back. I mean, in our desire to try and provide information to the news media as quickly as we can, we had two PIOs. We had one on the scene where the majority of the news media were. There was actually no announcement made there. There was a PIO at our station who overheard a conversation that the scene was clear. He called to one of our on-duty supervisors and said, "Am I hearing right that they're clearing? There's nothing there?" She said, "Yes, they haven't found anything yet. They're continuing to do the search." And he put out to a few people that called our station, not in the form of a press conference at the scene. He told them essentially that they haven't located anything yet, that there's a more methodical search continuing. And he based that on the fact that he knew that all SWAT teams usually do a primary and secondary search. I think two things happened there. I think some people misinterpreted that, packed up their bags and went home, and they're real upset they didn't get the story. But the second thing is, and I take responsibility for that, we weren't really clear about that. And we apologize. I apologize to all the news media who were misled by that, whether intentional or not. There was obviously some misconceptions over that. The other issue of when we released the information that the body was in there was a tactical consideration. We had a major highway close, A1A, Collins Avenue. We had people waiting for hours to get to their residence and hadn't been able to get there. We had hundreds and hundreds of representatives of the media who we needed to bring up closer to the scene, and we had the scene itself that we had great concern for in terms of how we're going to protect this, how we're going to bring the media up, and how we're going to open up Collins Avenue. So we sat and said, before we just announce this and have everybody swarm us, let's come up with a plan. Let's get up the cones, the barricades, whatever we need to do this right. Let's bring all the media did, and we did. We brought the media up first before we opened up Collins Avenue, gave them the lot, set them up in an organized fashion, and then systematically opened up up to traffic. And as soon as we felt comfortable with that, we told them there is a body in there, and we hoped to have gotten a positive identification much quicker than we did, but we didn't. So,
Chief, in reality, the special response team members knew within a couple of minutes that there was a body inside once they made entry.
Correct. They knew in a couple of minutes, and they told us as soon as they cleared the scene. They briefed their commander. Their commander called myself, representatives of the FBI and FDLE together, and told us the information. And that was another concern of ours. We wanted, and the SRT wanted, to clear the scene and leave after an orderly transition back to the Miami Beach Police Department. So that was another thing we looked at.
Now, Kathy, you've had a lot of contact with the Versace family. Have you talked to them since Cunanan committed suicide?
Yeah, I spoke to Donatella. My days are a little confused now, but the morning that his body was found, about 5:30 in the morning, to let them know in advance of the media so they wouldn't wake up to it. And there was typical mixed emotions that you'll find with surviving members in homicide cases. It was relief, but renewed grief, and also an expression that they were happy that no one else could be a victim of this person again.
So were they pretty well confident from the very beginning that in fact, when you all said you were going after Andrew Cunanan as the prime suspect, that in fact he was the perpetrator or the murderer?
They had nothing but good things to say for the police department, for the FBI, for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They were very grateful to all the law enforcement effort and the community. Through this entire thing, they have been incredibly gracious and magnanimous about Miami, and they don't hold Miami responsible for any of this. So really all along they've been quite a family, I think, very supportive.
We're going to take a quick break and we will continue on Montage in just a moment. Stay tuned. Andrew Cunanan is suspected in 5 murders. This is the crime scene of the one that really brought him to the world's attention, the murder of Gianni Versace. As we continue now our discussion of this saga that really went on for a couple of weeks here in Miami, let me ask you, is this something that, would you have anticipated the end that it came to?
We certainly anticipated that this could have been the end. We also anticipated this could have been a firestorm, a shootout, a last stand on the part of Mr. Cunanan, but fortunately for us, it did not go that way, and it went this way.
Do you think initially there's been so much talk about how he was taunting everyone, there was so much media attention, he was enjoying this, he was laughing at it, he was laughing at police perhaps. Do you think in retrospect that some of the clues that were left behind were in fact because he was taunting, or was it more because he was just trapped?
Well, I don't know. A lot of that is the product of so-called criminalist experts that have surfaced here to offer their theories. I think he was a very desperate person. I think he was on the run from the day he left Versace's. The crime scene there, he didn't make it very far. He made it 40 blocks. He was holed up, like an animal cornered, and really had nowhere to go.
Kathy, how do you think the media attention altered this case?
Well, I think it helped a great deal in promoting the attention that law enforcement had on this. I mean, the entire effort by law enforcement was so intense, so complete, and you couldn't miss that. I mean, every time you turned on your set or you picked up a paper, it was very clear that he was surrounded. And I tend to agree with the chief. I think that when you look back on this, what we see is a very desperate individual who did feel trapped.
Paul, from a national standpoint, did he really have anywhere he could go?
Probably not. I think everybody was looking for him, and they, in some cases, seeing him where he wasn't. And I think it's clear that in all of his crimes, this was the first time that we were right behind him. And so, leaving this stuff by the truck could very well be that he just didn't have time to pack up and get out. We were just that close, and we kept the pressure on. And you know, from the very beginning, we agreed that we would proceed as though he were in the Miami Beach, and we would keep the pressure on until such time as we found him or had a credible sighting elsewhere. And we thought that would work. Now, some of the experts disagreed with us, but as it turned out, just plain old-fashioned police work worked. That's what brought him to ground.
Were you surprised he was found so close? Anybody?
I'm not. No,
No.
not at all.
No.
Well, we said he was close. We said that all along. We told you he was close.
I'll admit that, yes, I think, and again, it's easy for everybody to be the armchair quarterback, but you felt like, at least in the first few hours, that he had opportunity, even if it was to get on the nearest bus and get out of town. And it was hard to imagine with that intensive manhunt that he wouldn't find a way to get off the hottest piece of real estate in America and at least hide out somewhere else, which I think brings up some of the issues about where they ultimately found him, this houseboat owned by Torsten Reineck, who runs a club out in Las Vegas, a gay club. And Paul and Chief, I'd put it to you, I think one of the questions we still have, FBI's talking to him, we understand, is there a tie between him and Torsten Reineck? I mean, he puts up in this houseboat for at least some period of time.
Well, you know, we don't know whether there's a tie or not. That's still being developed, but it may come as a surprise to folks in the rest of the world. But all of us know that down here in South Florida, there are a lot of residences that are only open during the winter. We have neighbors that only show up during the winter. And so it's no surprise to us that it'd be holed up someplace like that, because you have to have some place where you're not likely to be disturbed and nobody's going to knock on the door, except for the caretaker in most cases, and you could hide out there.
But for us lay people, when you mentioned that there was no sign of forced entry the other day, first of all, does that still hold true? And when you say no sign of forced entry, you start thinking, then how does the guy get into the place if he doesn't either know Reineck or have an associate who's friends with Reineck and gets him into that place? Chief?
Yeah, well, first off, there was no apparent sign of forced entry. That is not to say there wasn't a forced entry or an unlawful entry. But my gut feeling is that something led him there. He didn't just pick this out of 100 other places he could have gone, some of them much more dense than this one. He may have been there before. He may have known about it. A friend may have told him about it. Something, and it's only speculation on my part, made him go there. And of course, that's one of the questions that is unanswered today, and that we will try to answer, is whether or not there was a connection between Reineck and him. And of course, our investigators are working on that as we speak.
Well, actually, the FBI spoke to Reineck in Las Vegas just the other day, right?
No, yesterday, I guess.
Okay, but he denies any knowledge of the man?
I know the report of his interview, but I just don't know what he said. I think it's been reported that he denied it, but I haven't seen that. I haven't seen the report, so I can't comment on that.
Well, we know Cunanan was reaching out to people he knew, asking for fake passports, fake ID. So how likely is it that he had some connections here in South Florida and may have been helped or assisted by someone?
It's possible.
I think it's a real possibility that someone could have assisted him, at least in the beginning. Whether they were assisting him in the end, and maybe they abandoned him in the end. Anybody that may have been helping him, and that contributed to his state of mind. Well, we may not know, and hopefully we will know. We will establish if anybody was harboring him. And I know Paul said it before, if we can do that, certainly we'll be looking to bring criminal charges against those individuals.
Robin, you had gotten some tips along the way that perhaps he had been staying in the houseboat, that maybe that had been called into a tip line over the weekend, or that he was staying in one of the nearby sailboats. You want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, maybe Paul can answer this question. We were told that there was a search done of a sailboat that was nearby this houseboat along Collins Avenue. Chief, if you can add to that. What, if anything, was found in there? We were told that there was a newspaper that was open to an article about Cunanan that may intrigue people to think, well, maybe he was reading about himself there. Do you have any evidence that he was even there?
I had a couple of papers in my house open to his page also.
I think we all do.
I don't think he was in my house either, you know.
Were there any newspapers that didn't have it?
Yeah,
Was that a good sighting?
Well, it could have been. You know, as the chief mentioned earlier, we had people out beating the bushes right in the neighborhood, right that very same day. And I mean, I don't know whether that search was instrumental. I don't think it was. I think the key to this is the caretaker.
From little I know, there was a report of him being on a sailboat. They went there. There was a different gentleman on the sailboat, and that person may have known of Cunanan from the past, but he certainly wasn't on that sailboat. It was interesting only because it was in close proximity to the houseboat that he was ultimately found on.
Well, since you say the key to discovering Cunanan was the caretaker, let's deal with this whole issue of the reward money. Why is there a question about whether or not this caretaker is going to get the reward money?
What's the question? I think I said this morning you can have my money. Next case.
So, how much is the FBI part of that
we only
reward?
kicked in $10,000. As soon as the chief is through with talking to him and the chief okays it, I'll give him the money. So.
And what about the $45,000? Are you prepared yet? Do you think ultimately he gets that money?
Well, I think he's certainly eligible for that money, and there's a consensus among the agencies that put up that money that if he is if his whole story pans out and everything is okay, then he should get it. Right now, this is just unraveled, and of course, there's questions that we want to ask. We want to continue to look at the scene because some of the hard questions still remain. How did Andrew Cunanan get on this boat? Is the caretaker's story absolutely credible? And there's no question that he had no knowledge that he was there. And we want to be very sure of that just before we hand him $45,000 of taxpayers' money.
But even if he did have knowledge that he was there, he still provided the tip that led to the capture. And in many instances, I would assume when people call into tip lines, it's because they've had some association with the criminal, right?
Well, that's in most cases, when you put up an award like that, you're looking for someone who has some specific information to call you and tell you where he's at, provide you with that link. And what occurred here really is not that case, albeit his information is what led to Cunanan. This was simply like any other ordinary citizen that walks into his house, finds a burglary in process, and backs out and calls the police for help. They show up, and in this case, it did turn out to be Andrew Cunanan. But there was no specific information. He didn't call us and say Andrew Cunanan's in the house.
But short of him having some involvement with Cunanan or Cunanan, I don't even know how to pronounce the guy's name anymore. I've heard it so many different ways.
Think of Buchanan.
Okay, all right. Short of him having some association with Cunanan, then he does get the reward money, is what you're saying.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And there was never any question about that. I don't think.
Are you surprised by the public reaction? I know during the news briefing yesterday, you had expressed some concerns. You weren't sure whether he was the appropriate person to get the reward.
Yeah, well, what I brought up was the circumstances that I just talked about here, is how that unraveled. But and knowing that money was coming from a number of sources, I didn't feel comfortable to sit there and give their money away. All along I felt that certainly he's eligible, and it needs to be considered. But I had to discuss it with the other agencies, and I've done that today. And everybody has a consensus that he's eligible for the reward.
Mm-hmm. What's the length of time do you think this investigation is going to continue for? How long do you think your organizations are going to have this over their heads?
I think that a lot depends. It is one of those very fluid situations. It also depends on where it takes us to tie in with other cases throughout the country. But it's like somebody said, how long does it take to write a good story? I don't know.
Do you anticipate finding more victims?
It could happen. There may be unfounded cases, like Paul mentioned earlier, that you suddenly find were, whether it was to steal a car, a crime of opportunity, or it was more of a targeted victim. We just don't know. Mm-hmm. We're just learning so much day by day.
Any evidence whatsoever at this point in this massive investigation that's been so highlighted that there are any other victims out there? Anything right now that leads you to have any thought in that direction, any of you?
No.
Not that jumps out at you now, no.
Is the safe open? Has the safe been opened?
No, it has not.
Okay. Do you know when that's going to happen?
I know that our investigators are looking at the legality of going beyond seizing the safe and actually entering it.
Okay.
And the real issue there is whether the original warrant, which was for Andrew Cunanan himself, would allow us to actually enter into the safe.
Okay.
Did you all worry? One of the questions that came up in this investigation was, based on everything we know, Cunanan may have been on the beach for 2 months. Do we know? We know he goes to a pawn shop based on him putting his signature there, pawns a coin. He needs money. There's also some belief that in that 2 months he had to come into contact with a great many people, and that a lot of them are now embarrassed by the association and said, wow, you know, it ends up I knew this guy or at least saw him. Did you run into any resistance as you tried to work sources of your own on the beach in terms of people who suddenly wanted to just shut up and pretend they'd never seen this guy, never heard of him? Was that a problem?
No, I don't think it was a real problem for us. My sense is that there are still people out there that haven't come forward and shared with us what they know about Andrew.
And his whereabouts on the beach?
Exactly. That may have associated with him prior to the Versace murder. And, you know, keep in mind, who would want to be associated with this guy at this point?
Mm-hmm.
Any evidence that he was involved in a male escort service? That was one of the rumors going around. Any credible evidence that he was involved in that as a male prostitute in order to finance
not with
his
respect
stay
to
on the
our
beach?
investigation. We haven't unraveled any information that he was here in Miami Beach involved in that kind of activity.
We were talking about what was inside the houseboat. Was there any evidence that he was doing drugs, that there were any drugs in there?
I don't know.
Also, I know that so much of the answers have died with him, but any word on when the fatal shot was fired? Was it after entry was made? Was it before, when the caretaker approached?
Well, you know, one could assume that the shot the caretaker heard was probably the shot in question. You know, that information will be married with the results of the medical examiner's test, who can somewhat predict the time of death, you know, within close proximity. And we'll be looking at and comparing that information as part of our investigation.
We'll be back with more on Montage in a moment. Stay tuned. Okay. Hello, everyone. We are back discussing the investigation and eventual resolution of the case involving Andrew Cunanan. This has been such a saga going on for the last couple of weeks. When you actually found the body, was his face recognizable?
My understanding is yes, it was. I mean, we had a couple of investigators who went in there and visually looked at him and expressed to us that they thought it was him. Of course, we wanted to be sure. We wanted to have some standard compared that would tell us it was him.
There were reports that he had a beard, that he had put on a lot of weight and things like that. Can you tell us anything about that?
I really don't have any other information with regard to whether he had a beard or whether his hair was short or long.
The only thing I heard was that he had put on a bit of weight. Yeah.
Well, for a while, reports were circulating that maybe he was out there dressed as a woman. And obviously that was speculation. Has there ever been anything to back that up?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Do you find any significant amount of money there? We've all wondered how he supported himself. Everywhere we went, when we talked to people, they said he'd pay for his food with cash. The people who said they cited him. Any significant amount of money found?
No, I'm not aware of it. I mean, if he's pawning a $50 coin that he had, I think that shows this. You know, he was probably pretty desperate to begin with, in terms of economics.
Did he know Versace? Do you believe? Do you believe there was any connection?
Well, that's another unanswered question at this time. Why did he pick out Versace? And everybody would like to think there is some connection, and there may be. But right at this point in time, we do not know.
Kathy, the family's adamant that he did not, right?
Correct. They have said many times that there was no connection, that Versace did not know Cunanan. So, and as the chief said, right now there isn't any evidence that ties any connection or knowledge between the two.
There was the Vanity Fair article, and Jennifer, you interviewed, I believe, the author of that article, that at least some time ago in the past there had been a connection. Have you all aggressively pursued that to see if they may have met out on the West Coast some years ago? How aggressively are leads like that followed up, Paul, as you went through this nationwide manhunt?
We'll look into it. Anybody that tells us that somebody had a connection with someone we're looking for, that'll be looked into. I don't know if it's much of an issue now, but certainly prior to his capture, that would have been an issue.
Based on the information you've already gathered, what do you suspect the motive was? What made this guy tick?
I don't think anybody can answer that at this time. We really don't know. I mean, there's all types of theories of why he exploded and went on this rampage. That he had found out he had AIDS and he was exacting some revenge on people that he might have felt responsible for that, but it could have been financial, or it could have been that he just, at least to respect to some of these people, that it's just by hapstance that they were the victims.
What's the most outlandish theory that you guys actually seriously considered? I mean, we've heard all kinds of things in connection with this case. Certainly in connection with Versace, for a while there were reports out that perhaps it was a mob-connected kind of thing. What's the most outlandish theory you all heard?
Heard or considered?
Well, that you seriously considered.
Heard, I mean, there are all sorts of bizarre things. I mean, from extraterrestrial, that sort of thing, you know. But you have to understand that while we work in this case, we're concerned with basic good police work, and we just weren't running on those tangents because they don't prove to be productive in the long run. What we do is we found his last place, got on the trail, and stayed on the trail as long as we could. And as we told everyone from the very beginning, we believe he's still here. Because in order for him to get away, he would have had to walk away from the crime scene and within 10 or 15 minutes gotten off the island. And we just didn't think he had time to do that. And that's basic police work. Now, all the other theories, and that they're all interesting, fascinating stuff, but I don't think they can be proven one way or the other.
It seemed that he was so successful in getting away with the crime and traveling, moving on.
That was before he got to Miami Beach. He went on to kill in every other city.
Are you surprised he wasn't able to do that even, let's say, when he was at the houseboat and the caretaker showed up? He had a truck outside.
That's an interesting question. Why didn't he just take out the caretaker and maybe take his truck and make his break, or have his last stand? You know, another unanswered question, really.
Speaking of basic good police work, you all have taken pot shots over the last few weeks. People, a young man who says, I spotted him at the sandwich shop. Police show up, Miami Beach police, but he gets away. Questions about whether you quickly processed the pawn shop information as fast as it could have been to get that word out. Questions about whether the publicity was intensive enough prior to the Versace murder. Did you all rate the work and answer the criticisms?
I think it's easy.
Both of you.
I think it's real easy to look at one of these cases and find fault in a number of areas. But you know, let's use an analogy like a hurricane. When a hurricane comes to town, I don't think we're ever really prepared for it. And there's some similarities here. You know, when those things occur, you don't have the kind of resources to deal with them as you would other things. But you learn from them, and hopefully you develop policies and procedures and new processes that will allow you to deal with these things the next time much better. I think we got a lot of unfair criticism. A lot of it is perception, but perception is very damaging. If people really knew the inner workings of a police department, the difficult things that we do, and if they really knew about the processes that we've been criticized for, they would understand greatly more. And I'll give you an example. I mean, we were criticized for so-called missing his apartment at the Normandy Shores. Well, what in fact happened is we had information that led us to a specific apartment there. The pawn shop ticket did that. We got a search warrant. We went there. We searched the room. We showed his picture to everybody there, including the clerk, who ultimately had a revelation 2 days later that she did remember seeing him. Nobody could remember him. We did an area canvass. We did a perimeter search of that whole area. We went to every apartment in that building, and those that we could enter legally, we entered, we searched. Those that we couldn't, we noted for future reference. 2 days later, she remembers now, seeing this picture, that she does remember him. And she also remembers that he was in a room. Of course, he was registered on an alias because the register was checked. And she calls the FBI, who call us, and we proceed to go up there. At the same time, she goes to the news media and allows them into the room. Mm-hmm. Of course, they contaminate the room, but we didn't miss the room. And nobody there identified him as being associated with any other room there. And we have a constitution in this country that doesn't allow us just to kick the doors in of every apartment in a building.
If I could, I'd just like to piggyback on that for a moment, because while the chief said there were some bumps that we're going to learn from for the future, I think there's another very beneficial lesson here, and that is that this community saw how a mixture and a commitment of combined law enforcement agencies worked so well together. And unlike other communities that you often see in the media, there was no turf issues. egocentricities were put to one side. It was a team. They worked well. It was a mean machine that really ended up trapping Cunanan. So I'm very proud of what the FBI did, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Miami Beach Police Department, and other agencies that offered to help, like DEA and ATF and all kinds of folks.
Well, that's actually a very good point, because I know that in my years of doing investigative work, the feds and the local police usually didn't get along at all. Certainly, you didn't mix in the state attorney's office. I mean, there was a lot of infighting, and this really did seem to be much more of a cooperative effort than you normally see. I mean, correct? Is that unique to this area, or is that something that's now becoming a new philosophy
this
nationwide?
This area is I think, not speaking for the FBI, because that's not my job to do that, but speaking for as someone looking at the other law enforcement agencies, you are incredibly blessed with tremendous talent in the leadership ranks. Every one of the chiefs in this county, Dade County, is concerned about getting along. Okay, we don't fight over crime here. Just tremendous support, tremendous cooperation, and I don't think it's never unusual for me to call Kathy, her to call me, and we chat about stuff. And we're in two different systems, but we cooperate and we work together and we try to find solutions to these things. And in this particular case, Miami Beach was a lead agency because they had a homicide. And that means that the Dade County Prosecutor's Office is a lead agency. The U.S. Attorney, the FBI, and all the other federal agencies took a back seat because we were supporting them. That's our job. Tomorrow it'll be FDLE that's in the lead, and we have no problem with that. And I think if you look at Dade County, particularly, with the tremendous leadership that we have here in all the agencies, it's typical. It's just typical. We get along so well, and I think that filters down to the troops also. We don't fight.
But that is a pretty unique situation and of recent vintage, right? I mean,
it is. And when you travel around, like we all do around the country, you will typically hear of what you said, that local government and federal government and this, but that isn't what happens here. And I really am proud to be part of this team. And I think what's more important is that the community can feel very good about the leadership that they have, as Paul said, in all these various agencies. And we do have a lot of agencies, a lot of law enforcement agencies, and unfortunately a lot of crime to share. So we got our work cut out.
When is it we're going to actually find out what the time of death was for Cunanan? How closely will we be able to pinpoint that?
Well, again, I mean, a lot will have to do with what the medical examiner tells us, and he will establish, at least within a framework of reference, the time of death.
When should we know that? By early next week?
I don't want to commit to that, but that information should be forthcoming soon.
So at this point in time, is everyone operating on the assumption that he put the gun in his mouth, as they say, when the caretaker opened the door? Is that what it is? Or
well, I think that's the explanation that at this point makes the most sense. Absent some conflicting evidence that would be developed in the investigation, that seems to be the most plausible explanation.
To get back to motive, at what point will we be able to learn, if ever, whether he did indeed have AIDS if he was HIV positive?
Well, assuming that AIDS would be a motive, and we may never know what the motive is. That may be one of the secrets he's taken with him. But on the issue of AIDS, I know a lot of people have asked about that. Right now, the law is very specific that it may not be made public. Whether or not we feel that is going to be important to the conclusion of this investigation remains to be seen. If we do, then the appropriate thing to do would be to take it to court and ask for a judge to issue an order for us to make that public.
Kathy, as the prosecutor or chief prosecutor, let's be hypothetical for a moment. Say he lived. How tough a case would it have been to put together? You had people who claim they saw him commit the shooting, but a defense lawyer, a good one, could have come in and said, not good witnesses. It would have been a largely circumstantial case. How tough would it have been? Give us the prosecutor eye view on how that would have gone.
Well, a lot would have depended on what we could have connected up with the other cases, we think, which was one reason we intended to meet with all of the other prosecutors. And the other thing is we still had witnesses coming in. For instance, we interviewed, or his detectives interviewed a witness yesterday who had fled for fear of retaliation. So there was a lot of work still to be done, so it's really too difficult to tell. Fortunately, that's one issue we don't have to worry about.
Robin and Michael, you two were instrumental in breaking many aspects of this case. Thank you for coming on Montage. When we come back, we're going to be joined by a psychologist who specializes in precisely these kinds of crimes, Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Montage. We are back speaking with Paul Phillip, FBI Special Agent in charge, Kathy Fernandez-Rundle, the Dade State Attorney, also Chief Richard Barreto of the Miami Beach Police Department. And also joining us right now, we have Dr. Harley Stock. Dr. Stock is a psychologist whose company deals with high-risk threat assessment, and particularly the kinds of crimes we're talking about today with Andrew Cunanan. And I guess Cunanan really doesn't fit any profile, does he? Any typical profile of either a serial murderer or, what's the other term?
A spree killer.
A spree killer.
He fits closer to a spree killer in that he appears to have revenge as a motive in terms, instead of an internally derived profile that a serial killer has. But when they write the books on this, Andrew Cunanan is going to have a new chapter in it.
Mm-hmm. These profiles that we normally look at for a serial killer, how useful are those to you in law enforcement, Paul?
Well, if you don't know the subject or anything about the subject, they can be very helpful. Once the subject's identified, they become less helpful, but still interesting.
Were you able to use any kind of a profile when exploring Cunanan?
Remember, by the time we got involved with the case, he was already identified.
Mm-hmm.
The profile will help you identify and eliminate people. For example, I say, well, the person's between the ages of 25 and 35. They're educated or not educated. Sometimes they can tell you perhaps a race or ethnic group or whatever. But once a person's identified, it's interesting, but I'm not sure all that useful.
Well, for everything we hear about Cunanan, he's a young, bright, we've heard almost genius-level kind of guy who was social climbing, a chronic liar, and liked to name drop. But nothing in that profile sounds particularly threatening. I mean, I'm sure we've all met people like that. What made him different from, all the other people out there like that?
Well, it certainly fits a lot of people, including lawyers that I know. So
none of them here, of course.
No, of course not. But that's the question we have to answer. But I think what we really need to think about in a guy like Cunanan, what makes it particularly scary, is because he seemed so normal, and that pathology can spring up so quickly that we perhaps can't trust people around us.
Well, I mean, but this can't be normal. I mean, this doesn't happen on a regular basis.
Right.
What about him would you look at? Would you look at, for example, I've heard theories about brain trauma. I don't know if any of you pay attention to that, or infections, or some sort of a disease process.
Everybody's looking for an excuse for their behavior. The fact that people have been bumped in the head or they had significant trauma doesn't make you into a serial killer, and it doesn't make you into a spree killer. What makes you into a spree killer is somebody who doesn't care about their behavior, doesn't care. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they decide that their needs should be put ahead of everyone else. It doesn't matter if they were hit in the head when they were a kid or not, if their mother didn't love them. That's not going to make you into a spree killer.
Mm-hmm. Kathy, I know your office has a couple serial killing cases coming up right now. Do you try and look into the psychological reasons behind the killings when you go into this, and do you usually find some sort of a common ground?
Generally, what we'll find is kind of what Paul was talking about. You look for a pattern between the various killings, and a lot of that lies with the type of victim. You might look geographically at the two serial murder cases we have pending now all happened in with the Miami area. So we know a lot once we know who the victims, if we can establish a pattern, if we can establish not only a pattern amongst the victims, but within an area. We don't tend to rely on that so much because we tend to look at physical evidence more to help guide us to where we need to go.
Harley, I know you were saying it doesn't surprise you that he would have put a gun in his mouth because that way he would have preserved his face and he was too vain to have done it the other way,
yes.
Right?
Yes, it's kind of interesting. I think, well, anytime, of course, you put the gun in your mouth, you have the obvious likelihood of the top of your head being blown off. But people like this are so egocentric, don't want to put it on the outside of their face themselves. If it happens internally, that's another issue. But we often see in these kind of killings where the people put the gun in their mouth as opposed to their temple or through their eye, for example.
Does it make sense to you that he would have killed himself immediately upon hearing the caretaker enter the house?
It's all speculation at this point. He certainly had an escape plan, which was suicide. Mm-hmm. Now, as far as I understand, when the caretaker came in, he drew a weapon, which might have led Mr. Cunanan to believe that this individual was the police, and therefore he enacted his escape plan.
Chief, were you anticipating getting into a gunfight with this guy?
Oh, certainly. That was one of the possibilities that we thought was very probable.
Were you a little surprised when you realized that he may very well have been dead the whole time?
No, I mean, you can look around the country and see any number of cases like this of people who have barricaded themselves and then taken their own life. So I think it's a pretty commonplace. You know, we were all concerned that, we'd heard the reports that this was going to be the Alamo, the last stand, and that was certainly a plausible possibility too.
And again, I think the professionalism of law enforcement came through again, the way it was handled and the way Metro-Dade was able to come in with its SWAT team and then make transition back. So again, I know that everyone was prepared for that. Unfortunately, that didn't have to happen.
The Metro-Dade SWAT team coming out, that's always, I would think for a criminal, that's got to be a very ominous thing. I mean, you're in the house, and at this point, where are you going? You know, when you're surrounded by a SWAT team, you really have no way out, do you? I mean, has anyone ever gotten out of a situation like that without surrendering?
Well, there have certainly been ensuing gun battles. Whether they were actually able to shoot their way out and escape, I'm not sure. But you know, Kathy said it, and she said it right. It's an ominous force that are very highly trained to achieve the specific objective of tactically resolving that situation. If it's extrapolating the person or if it's serving a warrant, whatever, they train very hard and very diligently to do these things, and they have equipment that's way beyond the resources of the normal officer on the street.
Well, so Harley, you would think that if he's going to commit suicide, he's probably going to do it when he thinks he's really cornered, right? I mean, do you think he might have thought he was cornered at that point?
Well, at that point, you know, tactically, he only had either he's going into the water or he's coming out the front door. But I really don't think it would have mattered if he was in an apartment house or where he was. The fact is, it's my feeling at least, that when he was confronted with police, he was going to remain in control and not allow police to kill him, that he was going to kill himself.
The thing that really baffled me is the murder of Miglin, if in fact he did do the murder of Miglin, because that was such a brutal and such an extremely brutal crime, with the throat being sawed and the binding of the face and all of that. And I know, Paul, you mentioned something earlier that sometimes a crime is just a crime.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there may have been something else behind it, but we often find people who have been tortured for information, whether it's about drugs or someone trying to get their ATM card number from them or whatever, that are tortured in a similar fashion, duct tape and wounds about the body and so on and so forth. I mean, I'll leave that sort of analysis to people that are trained to do that. And there is a body, a group of folks that study that very issue, looking at the wounds and trying to determine what sort of psychosis the subject suffered from. But I'm just not prepared to make that leap, perhaps.
So you're willing to say then maybe rather than looking at that as such a ritualistic crime, that maybe it was just a way to extract info.
Could be robbery. It could be looking for an ATM card PIN number. It could be looking for keys to a car, other information. I mean, it's...
It could be the same thing. Many have speculated with the victim at the graveyard in New Jersey, that it was a crime of opportunity. He knew that he was known to be in the Lexus. He needed a car, and that person just happened to be there at the wrong time. Just don't know.
Let me just comment about that. You know, with a serial killer, a serial killer has a profile in his mind. He gets anxiety about killing, and then has fantasies and goes out and kills, which relieves the anxiety. A spree killer determines before he sets on the spree who he's going to kill, and therefore he can take more time to do it. But what's different about Cunanan is he's also an opportunistic killer. And so we have an opportunistic killer, a spree killer, some components of a serial killer. So psychological profile might be helpful, but it's not necessarily a pure explanation. It helps contribute sometimes, but in a guy like this, it really can't tell you every single reason why he did it. We can just make some suppositions.
So should we be thinking, since he doesn't fit any profile, that maybe one or more of these crimes he's not responsible for? Would you think that maybe there was something else, or do you think he's sufficiently connected at this point that you'd rewrite the book, so to speak, on these kind of crimes instead?
I think that's one of the reasons it's so important now to really complete the investigation. I know we all want to have these answers yesterday, and it's understandable, but there really is so much work that still needs to be done. And hopefully we'll have some of these answers. We may never have all of them, but we certainly should know more in the next months, in the next forthcoming months.
Let me say something a little about this, about prediction and what you can learn from a case like this. You know, the Bureau and other law enforcement agencies, I think, did an unbelievable job. In the sense, this is the first case, at least I know, where they're able to proactively say, you've got a serial killer in your community, and you better watch out. Now, the fact is, whether they distributed 2,000 or 10,000 flyers doesn't matter, that they were able to go into community and have people join them in hunting this guy down. And I think that law enforcement has gotten a bad rap to say, well, gosh, the guy's driving a red vehicle and you should have been able to find him. That'd be virtually impossible to do.
Well, Chief, were you at all surprised at the amount of community support you got and the number of tips that were pouring in?
Well, absolutely, and I've said it all along. I think there's three groups that have to take credit for this. Law enforcement, the media certainly, and the general public. They've all come together, and collectively we put the kind of pressure on Andrew Cunanan that we needed to put on him.
And does everyone agree that if it had not been for some of that pressure, that he probably would have left and gone on to perhaps kill again?
Absolutely. This guy would have continued to kill until he was stopped. So this kind of relationship is what drove him to ground and brought an end to this situation.
Okay. Dr. Harley Stock, Chief Richard Barreto of the Miami Beach Police Department, Kathy Rundle, Dade State Attorney Office, and Paul Phillip, Special Agent in charge of the FBI. Thank you all very much for being here. We look to the three of you in particular for all the answers and guidance and courage through these last couple of weeks, and we appreciate your being here very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the good work. And that's it for our program this time. We'll see you again next time on Montage. Take care, everyone.